10 years ago, I married the most beautiful woman, a dream of mine named Ethel. For 10 years, we lived enjoying life. I taught physics at the local high school in our small, sleepy little town a stone's throw from the borders of a huge national park. Ethel was a ranger there, the keeper of those forests. Our little wooden house stood at the edge of the forest, like a sentinel on the border of two worlds. Every morning, Ethel would disappear into the heart of the woods, armed with a walkie-talkie and a thermos of hot coffee, leaving me alone with our quiet home. I drove to school in our old Ford, looping the serpentine roads through our little town, and each day passed as quietly as the last, painting a picture of small-town tranquility. 2 days ago, that tranquility shattered. Ethel went out into the woods as always, but this time she didn't return. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, staring at her empty chair, waiting for the familiar crunch of her boots on the gravel outside. But the night came, and she didn't. The silence of our cabin was as oppressive as the dark forest beyond. The first panic of her absence was replaced by anxiety when she didn't return the next day. I enlisted the help of the only man I knew, Billy, the local sheriff, a childhood friend. Together we scoured the woods, calling out her name, hope melting by the minute. Hours turned into an entire day, and just as despair began to creep into our souls, we found her. Deep in the woods, under a canopy of tall pines, Ethel lay unconscious and strangely calm, as if she were just sleeping. Billy and I carried her out of the woods. She seemed unusually heavy. The local hospital was hardly more than a glorified clinic, but the doctors there did what they could. Ethel was stable, they said, but they had no idea why she wouldn't wake up. Her vitals were normal. Her blood work showed nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if she'd merely decided to sleep and forgotten to wake up. And then, she did. Her eyes fluttered open to reveal the familiar emerald green, now clouded with confusion. The relief of seeing her awake was cut short when she looked at me, not with the familiar warmth, but with cold unfamiliarity. "Ethel, it's me, Jack," I stammered, reaching out to take her hand. She didn't pull away, but there was a hesitancy in her touch that wasn't there before. For a moment, the hospital room disappeared, and all I could see was her. The woman I'd loved for more than a decade. The woman who now didn't know who I was. It had been 2 weeks since the terrible day we found Ethel in the woods. The doctors discharged her, seeing no reason to keep her under observation any longer. Physically, they said, she was in good shape. I was concerned about Ethel's behavior. She was cold. There was an aloofness in her eyes that made my heart ache. She remembered things. Our wedding day, our first house, the names of our nieces and nephews. She remembered me. But the recognition didn't bring warmth. She looked at me as if I were a puzzle to solve, an enigma wrapped in a familiar skin. "Jack," she'd say, testing my name in her mouth as if it was foreign. "You are my husband." A statement, not a sentiment. Her affinity for solitude grew. She was always a loner, but now she'd spend hours by herself, avoiding my company. The conversations were brief, filled with uneasy silence. Our home, once filled with the pleasant familiarity of shared domesticity, now seemed to echo with absence. Every corner, every piece of furniture, bore the ghost of the woman she used to be. One night, sleep had evaded me. I tossed and turned, acutely aware of the emptiness next to me. The silence of our bedroom was broken by a soft thud downstairs. I froze, listening. Another thud, followed by the creak of a floorboard. Ethel. Leaving our bed, I moved quietly down the stairs, drawn towards the noise. The sight that met me was eerie. Ethel, standing motionless by the living room window, her body bathed in the ghostly moonlight streaming through the glass. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the moon. "Ethel?" I asked tentatively, hoping to break her from this trance. No response. Suddenly she convulsed, her head moving erratically, her arms flailing in an unsettling, unnatural dance. Deep, guttural noises, unlike any sound a human should make, escaped her lips. "Ethel!" Panic gripped me. I grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to steady her, to snap her out of it. She stopped abruptly, her movements ceasing as abruptly as they had begun. Then she turned towards me, her eyes wild, uncomprehending. Raising a shaky hand, she pointed at me and screamed, a blood-curdling sound that resonated through our quiet home. Then she crumpled to the floor, unconscious. In the silence that followed, my heart pounded in my chest. The moonlight no longer felt serene, casting grotesque shadows around the room. I dialed the hospital, my hands shaking, my mind racing with horrifying possibilities. As I waited for the ambulance, I held Ethel close, whispering words of comfort I didn't believe myself. Her body was limp in my arms, her breath shallow. As fear crept in, my mind filled with one daunting question. What had the forest done to my Ethel? The glaring hospital lights were too stark, too clinical for my comfort. Ethel lay there in the hospital bed, her pale skin contrasting with the sterile white sheets. Her eyes flickered open, meeting mine with a cold, disquieting clarity. Again, she couldn't recall what had transpired the night before. I felt helpless. The woman lying in front of me was my wife, but the ethereal connection that had bound us was missing. Each moment spent with her only deepened my dread, the gnawing fear of losing her forever. The desperation in my voice surprised me. "Ethel, please, you have to remember. The woods, when you went missing. Do you remember anything? Anything at all?" Her brows furrowed slightly, her gaze faltering. I can't recall. Jack, I just need some rest. I'm just overworked, that's all. I'll be fine." She offered me a smile, a feeble attempt at assurance. But her smile wasn't the same. The joyous curve that would lift her cheeks was replaced with a tight, forced line. This new smile was a stranger to me. It was a lie that only further solidified my growing fear. I wanted to scream, rage at the world, at the unfairness of it all. But instead, I just sat there, holding her cold hand in mine, forcing a smile, pretending that things were normal, that we were just a normal couple who had weathered a small storm. The room fell into silence. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors became a background melody to my spiraling thoughts. We returned home after a few days. Ethel went back to being a ranger, insisting that she felt better when she was in the woods. The irony wasn't lost on me. I returned to teaching, my sanctuary amidst this storm. The equations, theorems, and formulae were constant, unaffected by the tumultuous upheavals of life. Each return to the cabin was fraught with painful uncertainty. The fear of discovering another strange aspect of my wife's behavior was constant, and each day the woman I loved grew more and more distant from me. One day, as I was immersed in solving physics problems, a familiar face pulled me out of my musings. Sheriff Billy. He stood at the door of my classroom, a solemn look on his usually jovial face. He had been my childhood friend, a bond forged in the modest expanse of our small town. But now, he looked different, aged perhaps, or burdened by the unseen. It mirrored my own affliction. He gestured for me to step out, concern etched on his face. "Jack, we need to talk." I followed him into the empty hallway, feeling an eerie sense of déjà vu. "What is it, Billy? Is it about Ethel?" He paused, clearing his throat before answering. "Yeah, I found something in the woods. I think you should see it for yourself." His cryptic words left me more anxious than ever. The terrifying thought of the woods withholding another horror made my heart hammer in my chest. But I had to know, for Ethel's sake. We decided to venture into the woods the next day. The following day arrived like a shroud. An extraordinary excitement took hold of my heart. I was ready to embark on a journey into the unknown, a journey that had the potential to either provide some answers or drive me further into despair. But Billy never showed up. Confusion and concern mingled within me. I reached for my phone, dialing Billy's number. An alien voice answered, a guttural sound, followed by a familiar, horrifying scream, a sound I'd heard from Ethel. The terror crept back in, unbidden, unwanted. Dropping the phone as if it burned, I decided to head to the sheriff's office. Billy was absent there as well. The deputy looked as bewildered as I felt. He said Billy has been gone since yesterday. Upon returning home, I saw the familiar sight of Billy's cruiser parked outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked towards the house. It was then I noticed the fresh dents on Billy's car, and fear gripped me as I neared the door. The familiar sounds of conversation reached me. Ethel and Billy, casually talking. I stepped into the room, my eyes drawn to their faces. Their smiles were similar, tight, forced, terrifyingly wrong. The same uncanny smile that Ethel had donned. Once alone with Billy, I asked about our missed appointment, about his sudden, unexplained visit. He dismissed my questions, his smile lingering a moment too long. I simply forgot, Jack. His abrupt departure left me in a swirl of confusion and fear. As I watched his cruiser disappear into the distance, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Billy's strange behavior, his sudden dismissal of our planned journey into the woods, only deepened my fears. I didn't know what to think or do, but I had to get answers. Later that night, Ethel went to bed early. I lay next to her, lost in my own thoughts, and the eerie echo of Billy and Ethel's laughter still echoed in my ears. I felt more isolated, more alone than ever. Billy's strange behavior, his resemblance to Ethel, all pointed to an ominous truth. Part of me was afraid of what might happen in the coming days, and yet I was determined to uncover the truth. My mind was a whirlpool of thoughts and fears. I looked at Ethel, asleep next to me, and could hardly recognize her. She was no longer the woman I had fallen in love with. The reality of our situation was beginning to sink in. I was losing Ethel, and it felt like I was losing myself along with her. The dread was unfathomable, the fear paralyzing. I thought of the guttural screams, Billy's sudden disappearance, his altered demeanor, and Ethel's transformation. They were all pieces of a horrifying puzzle that I had to solve. What was causing it? Was there a way to reverse it? The darkest hours of the night found me with wide-open eyes, staring at the ceiling and listening to the eerie silence of our cabin. The sight of Ethel slipping out of bed yanked me from my daze. The hushed rustle of sheets was the only sound that marked her departure. Resting in the moonlit shadow, I watched her silhouette glide out of the room. A strange determination flickered through me, compelling me to follow her. Maybe tonight I would finally find answers to the mysteries that surrounded Ethel in this town. I trailed behind her, moving through the tall trees bathed in the ghostly light of the moon. The woods were never quiet, but tonight their whispers seemed louder, more urgent. My heart pounded as I watched Ethel move farther into the darkness. The familiar figure of my wife, lost in this dense wilderness, was a sight that sent chills down my spine. Her movements were unnatural, unsettling. Her head jerked oddly from side to side, and at times she would stoop, releasing a guttural noise that echoed through the silent woods. The sight was as surreal as it was terrifying. The most horrifying moment arrived when she abruptly got down on all fours and dashed into the depths of the forest. She was fast, swift like a wild animal, disappearing into the dark abyss within seconds. I was left standing alone, the silence of the woods pressing heavily upon me. My fear quickly turned into dread, the kind that wraps around your heart and squeezes till it aches. Suddenly I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned around slowly, the chilling scream of Billy over the phone replaying in my mind. I squinted through the darkness, trying to make out the figure that had appeared out of nowhere. It was Carl, also a ranger, a colleague of Ethel's. I remembered him always cheerful and friendly, but the man I saw now was far from the Carl I knew. There he was, perched atop a fallen tree trunk, his menacing gaze locked onto me. He resembled a feral beast, waiting for the right moment to pounce on its prey. My heart pounded in my chest, fear gripping me as I realized the danger I was in. Summoning every ounce of courage, I did the unthinkable. I got down on all fours, mirroring Ethel's unnatural movements, and imitated the guttural sounds she had been making. Carl stared at me for a moment. Then he let out a horrifying scream that echoed through the woods and darted off into the darkness. I was left alone again, my heart hammering against my ribcage, the taste of fear fresh on my tongue. My mind was spinning with a whirlpool of thoughts. It was all too much. Ethel's transformation, Billy's odd behavior, Carl's terrifying encounter, and this damned forest slash. The questions were piling up, but the answers seemed to be slipping further out of my reach. With heavy steps, I began my journey back to our cabin, dreading what I would find next in this nightmarish reality. My journey back felt like a lifetime. The woods that were once my sanctuary now carried an eerie disquiet. My senses were heightened, every rustle and whisper sending cold shivers down my spine. I was a stranger in my own town, a man lost in a reality that was growing darker with each passing moment. I halted abruptly when I heard the guttural sounds nearby. It was the same unsettling noise Ethel had been making. A chill ran down my spine as I moved towards it, cautiously treading through the dense undergrowth. A sight unlike any other met my eyes. A clearing, bathed in silver moonlight, was filled with familiar faces. Billy, Carl, Ethel, a sheriff's deputy, a couple of acquaintances from school, and many other townspeople. They were all there, moving in an animalistic way, running on all fours, their cries echoing through the silent woods. Then I noticed Billy. His eyes locked onto mine, a strange recognition flickering in them. He let out a blood-curdling scream, the same scream I had heard over the phone. Suddenly they all turned towards me, their eyes mirroring the same terrifying rage that I had seen in Carl. I froze. Fear gripped me as they started moving in my direction. Reality was disintegrating around me, replaced by this unfathomable horror. I found myself running, dashing through the trees and tripping over fallen branches. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I raced for my life. My foot slipped, and I tumbled down a steep ravine. Pain seared through my body as I collided with the rough rocks, my ribs protesting with a sickening crunch. I lay there, battered and bruised, gasping for air as the fear threatened to drown me. The realization hit me hard. There was no escape. As I gathered my strength to stand, a rustling noise made me turn around. My heart stopped. It was Ethel, her eyes locked onto mine, her body poised in that monstrous stance. A whimper escaped my lips as she began to move closer. I could do nothing but watch as the woman I loved turned into a terrifying creature. Tears streamed down my face, the fear momentarily replaced by an overwhelming grief. I fell to my knees, staring into her eyes, the eyes that were once filled with love. I choked out a confession, my voice trembling with emotions. I confessed my dreams of a future, of having children, of growing old together. It was my last plea, a desperate attempt to reach out to her, to the woman she once was, to the one that was my dream, my only one. Her movements halted abruptly. For a moment her eyes flickered with a distant memory, a shred of humanity that was buried deep within her. She growled, the guttural sound now forming a semblance of human language. "Get out! Get out! Further!" Without a second thought, she turned away and disappeared into the woods, her scream echoing through the silent night. She led the other creatures away from me. She saved me, leaving unbearable pain in my heart. I was left alone, once again, in the silence of the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. I returned to the cabin, the reality of the situation sinking in. I knew I had to leave. I had to escape before this town, the people, swallowed me into its darkness. The love for Ethel held me back, but the horrifying reality urged me forward. It was time to leave everything behind. It was a crisp June morning, the kind that starts off with a cool breeze rustling through the leaves, promising to turn into a beautiful day. I started my usual patrol, walking the trails, checking the flora, and watching the fauna. Birds were singing their morning songs, and I felt the serenity that usually accompanies these woods. A subtle metallic scent hit my nostrils, out of place amidst the natural smell of dirt, leaves, and bark. I followed the scent, my heart pounding. The sight I stumbled upon was anything but natural. There, in the midst of the ferns, lay the lifeless body of a squirrel. Its small form had been torn apart brutally, much more than what was needed for a quick kill. A few paces ahead, a similar sight greeted me. A fox this time, its bushy tail now still, and its once vibrant eyes vacant. The further I walked, the more such grisly scenes I encountered. The woods seemed to grow quieter, the cheeriness of the morning replaced by an eerie stillness. I felt an instinctual dread growing within me. This wasn't the work of a predator hunting for food. No, something else was at play here. I knelt next to one of the victims, a deer this time. The wounds were deep but oddly precise, as if inflicted by a small, sharp object. The corpses, though horribly mutilated, were largely untouched, the flesh still on their bones, the predator having left the prey uneaten. The pitter-patter of rain against leaves drew my attention away from the corpse. I found myself staring at a set of tracks leading away from the bloodbath. The paw prints were small, about the size of my palm, bearing the distinctive marks of a raccoon. The tracks led me through the dense undergrowth. The forest felt alien, hostile even, as though resenting my intrusion. I walked on, the sense of dread accompanying each step. A peculiar sight stopped me dead in my tracks. A bear, or what was left of it, lay sprawled across the clearing, its enormous form torn apart much like the smaller animals. The sight of the mighty creature reduced to such a state sent chills down my spine. In that moment, I felt the woods holding their breath, watching, waiting. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't just a brutal killing. It was a statement, a blatant display of power. "Carl, do you copy?" My radio crackled to life, shattering the eerie silence. "What's your location, Carl?" "Jim." My colleague's voice sounded tinny and distant, a stark contrast to the gruesome reality I was living. "I've got a situation here," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, my gaze fixed on the horrific sight before me. The bear lay torn apart, a grotesque testament to the force that had been unleashed here. It was disturbing, yet my gaze was fixed, my mind whirling, trying to make sense of this impossible scene. The bear's lifeless eyes mirrored my growing fear. I shuddered, stepping back, only then noticing the sun beginning its descent. The woods quickly started to darken. I've always loved the sunset, the serene transition from day to night. But tonight, it was a reminder of my isolation. The beauty of the woods twisted into a macabre spectacle by the looming darkness. Knowing I had to stick around until reinforcements arrived, I pitched my tent and made a fire. The crackling flames provided a comforting contrast to the chilly dread that had descended upon the woods. "Carl, what's the situation?" The radio buzzed again, Jim's concerned voice piercing the silent woods. "I found more bodies," I responded, forcing the words out. "Including a bear, all with the same mutilations." There was a pause, and I could almost hear Jim's mind whirling on the other end. "Jesus, Carl, you sure it's a raccoon?" His voice trembled slightly, the professional mask slipping. "I've never seen anything like this, Jim, but the tracks, they match," I admitted, rubbing my temples. "I need backup." "Roger that. We're on our way. Stay safe, Carl," Jim said, his voice filled with a resolve that I wished I felt. The forest was a stark contrast to the comforting familiarity of the human voice. It was closing in on me. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig seemed to echo in the darkness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, a pair of burning eyes staring at me. As I looked around, more pairs of eyes appeared, their eerie glow punctuating the darkness. They watched me silently, their gaze never wavering. A cold sweat trickled down my back. I felt like a deer caught in the headlights. I grabbed the radio, my hand shaking slightly. "Jim, "I've got company," I managed to mutter into the radio. "Carl, you there?" Jim's voice was met with silence as I stared at the eyes circling me. "Carl, what's happening?" His voice was frantic now, but I was too entranced by the eyes to reply. The haunting silence of the forest was broken only by the crackling of the fire and my own heartbeat, ringing loudly in my ears. As darkness fell completely, the woods transformed into a nightmarish landscape. I was a stranger here, an intruder in my own sanctuary. The eyes, unblinking, continued to watch me, their eerie glow burning brighter in the pitch-black darkness. The woods were mine, but tonight, I felt like a trespasser. The glowing eyes surrounded me, a haunting spectacle, the silence only broken by the crackle of the fire. I felt the weight of the gaze, as if each pair of eyes was burrowing into my soul. Then, with an unnerving suddenness, the bushes rustled. From the inky blackness emerged not one, but several raccoons. Their fur was matted with blood, white foam frothing at their mouths. Their eyes were wild, almost rabid, reflecting the dancing flames of my fire. One of them, a larger specimen, had a torn ear and a wicked gash running down its flank. Yet it seemed unfazed, its focus unwavering. Time seemed to slow as they encircled the fire, their eyes never leaving me. Their feral stares sent shivers down my spine. Fear washed over me, but it was different now. It was no longer about the unknown, about what was lurking in the dark. Now the horror was right before me, illuminated by the dancing flames, undeniable, unavoidable. Then, as if spurred by an unseen command, one of them lunged. Its sudden movement broke the tableau, triggering a surge of adrenaline. I grasped a burning branch from the fire, the searing heat momentarily distracting me from the looming threat. I waved it menacingly at the raccoon, the flames casting an erratic, shifting shadow on its snarling face. But even as I wielded my makeshift weapon, a cold realization gripped me. The flames wouldn't last forever, and there were too many of them. I had to get away. In a desperate move, I kicked the fire, sending embers flying in all directions. The raccoons scattered, startled by the sudden burst of sparks. I seized the opportunity and ran, the blazing branch held aloft, casting long, sinister shadows in the moonlit woods. I had always felt at home in the woods, but tonight, the familiar paths were menacing, the trees reaching out like gnarled hands, ready to ensnare me. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, matching the rhythmic thumping of my boots against the forest floor. The rustling behind me was a constant reminder of the predators in pursuit, their growls echoing ominously. There was something profoundly terrifying about being hunted, about being the prey. The knowledge of being pursued by those rabid creatures was a chilling presence at the back of my mind. Every shadow seemed to morph into a lunging beast, every rustle a herald of my impending doom. The fear was intoxicating, making the forest feel otherworldly, a nightmarish landscape bathed in silvery moonlight. Suddenly, I broke into a clearing, my flight momentarily halted by the sight before me. Through the thicket, I could see a mass of raccoons swarming across the field like an undulating wave. Their movements were unnatural, their bodies contorted as they ran on all fours, the grass rustling ominously under their charge. Seeing no other option, I continued my sprint, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I veered back into the woods, my frantic gaze catching sight of raccoons swarming through the trees, their agile bodies twisting and turning with an uncanny dexterity. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. Just as I thought I could run no more, the forest gave way to a sudden cliff. The roar of the river below echoed up the rocky expanse, its rushing waters promising salvation. Without a second thought, I leaped, plunging into the icy waters. As I fought against the current, I dared to glance back. There, at the edge of the cliff, stood a multitude of animals. The raccoons were among them, their eyes reflecting the moonlight, creating a tableau of glimmering points staring down at me. It was a haunting sight, one that would be forever seared into my memory. I had escaped, but the sense of dread, the terror of the chase, was far from over. The river was harsh and unforgiving, its icy grasp threatening to pull me under. But my will to survive pushed me forward. I kicked against the current, the chilling water offering a stark contrast to the fiery chase. I was no longer the ranger keeping watch over the forest, but a mere creature clinging to life, humbled by the power of nature. Looking back, I saw the animals disperse, their shapes becoming smaller as the river carried me away. I was alive, but the forest I once knew was forever changed. The terror I had experienced was not just a fleeting moment of fear. It was a realization. I was part of a larger world, one where man was not always the hunter, but could become the hunted. As the adrenaline subsided, exhaustion set in. I let the river carry me, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The horror I had experienced, the savagery I had witnessed, the primal fear I had felt, they had shattered my perception of the world, of my place in it. I floated along the river, my pulse beginning to subside, its frenzied beat no longer matching the rapid flow of the water beneath me. The moon, now at its zenith, cast an ethereal glow on the inky expanse, creating a stark contrast to the predatory shadows that lay behind. The river, my sanctuary from the nightmarish chase, was carrying me back to the world I knew. In my years as a ranger, I'd often marveled at the silent power of the river. Its constant flow, its ability to carve through stone and shape the landscape, was a humbling reminder of nature's resilience. Tonight, its relentless force had saved me, its icy waters offering a refuge from the terror that had consumed the forest. I let the current guide me, my mind wandering back to the haunting tableau I'd left behind. The horde of creatures perched on the edge of the cliff, their eyes aglow in the moonlight, were seared into my memory. It was a sight that challenged everything I'd believed about the wilderness. The night's events had left me rattled, my heart still heavy with a primal fear I'd never known. Yet as the adrenaline wore off, I couldn't shake off a strange sense of wonder. The forest, my forest, had unveiled a darker, brutal side, a facet that existed beyond the comforting predictability of the trails and the trees. As I swam towards the distant shoreline, my thoughts were interrupted by the sight of the ranger base, its silhouette illuminated against the star-studded sky. It stood as a beacon of civilization, a stark contrast to the wild beauty I had just escaped. Exhausted, I dragged myself onto the shore, the soft sand beneath me offering a welcoming respite. I lay there for a moment, my gaze fixed on the twinkling stars above. Their serene beauty was a comforting contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Rejuvenated, I made my way towards the base, my mind filled with the grim task of recounting the night's events. It wasn't just about survival anymore. I needed to warn them, to prepare them for the horrors that lurked within our sanctuary. As I approached, the familiar sight of the wooden cabin, its walls aglow with soft yellow light, was a reassurance. The hum of activity was a comforting reminder of the world I was part of, a stark contrast to the predatory silence I'd left behind. "Carl!" Jim's voice rang out as I walked in, his concern palpable. The room fell silent, all eyes on me. I looked around, my gaze meeting a mix of relief, apprehension, and curiosity. I took a deep breath, ready to recount the tale, to warn them of the monstrous predators that lay beyond the safety of the base. My voice echoed in the silent room, my story met with stunned silence, then a flurry of hurried whispers and anxious glances. As the room buzzed with activity, I stood there, a sense of relief washing over me. I had survived, had escaped the horrors of the forest, and had warned my fellow rangers. I had done my part. But the image of the rabid raccoons, their menacing eyes glowing in the darkness, would forever be etched in my memory. It was a chilling reminder of the night the forest turned on me, the night I became the prey,